can drift in as they come. So thank you all so much for joining. It's lovely to see you all. We're going to be looking at something extremely unusual and rarely discussed tonight, which is a passage in Deuteronomy about breaking a cow's neck as a way of dealing with an unsolved murder. As I've said in some of the promotions, this is something that was planned a very long time ago, and actually, very sadly, a lot of the material has ended up being really quite topical and quite relevant to things that are happening at the moment. And we'll see how some of those work as we go on. As usual, the handout will be displayed on the screen, and I've just popped a link in the chat to anyone who would like to open it in any other way. And we're going to start by looking at exactly what this ritual was. So, is there someone who would like to read this block of Deuteronomy for us?
I'll give it a whirl.
Please do.
Okay, right, here we go. If a slain corpse is found in the land that the Eternal One of your God has given you to possess, and they are lying in the open, and it is not known who is responsible, your elders and judges shall go out and measure how far the corpse is from the surrounding towns. The elders of the town nearest to the corpse shall take a heifer, which has never been put to work, which has never pulled a yoke from the herd, and the elders of the town shall bring the heifer down into an unplanted wadi, and there in the wadi they shall break the heifer's neck. The Levitical priests shall draw near, for the Eternal One your God has chosen them as ministers to give blessings in the divine name, and every dispute and incident is to be determined by them. And all the elders of the town closest to the corpse shall wash their hands over the heifer, whose neck was broken in the wadi. And they shall certify, our hands did not spill this blood, and our eyes did not see. Forgive your people Israel, whom you redeemed, Eternal One, and do not let the blood of the innocent remain among your people. And atonement shall be made for them and for the blood. And thus you will remove blood guilt from your midst by doing what is proper in the eyes of the Eternal One.
Beautiful, thank you. So, just by way of sort of show of hands, who was familiar with this as a crime-solving method that we have in our tradition?
Vaguely.
Cool, so we got some of them there. Who has a clue what is going on there and what possible meaning might be lying behind this? It's much more tricky, isn't it? So this session is going to be in kind of two parts. In the first part, we're going to be looking at what the possible meaning of this whole ritual is, what the whole shebang is doing there. And then we're going to go on to look at this very particular phrase, our hands did not spill this blood and our eyes did not see, because quite a lot of the commentary seems to focus precisely on those words and on the people who are saying it. So do your best to drink in all the different elements of this very strange procedure, and we will be coming back to all of them in due course. First of all, we can turn to the appropriately named Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, because we are all particularly perplexed by what's going on here, and he has an interesting starting point for us. Elizabeth, would you like to read a little bit of Maimonides for us?
The advantages of the broken-necked heifer are clear, for it is the town nearest to the victim that brings the heifer, and the murderer normally comes from that place. It is inconceivable that the investigation, the procession of the elders, and the taking of the heifer will not arouse comment. By making the event public, the murderer may be found. Force is added by the rule that the place in which the neck of the heifer is broken should never be cultivated or sown. The owner of the land will therefore be motivated to search and to find the murderer, in order that the heifer be not killed and the land be not made useless.
Thank you. So, what is Maimonides' explanation for this tradition? If we had to summarize what he's saying the point is.
It's certainly that this process has an investigative element to it.
You're being a little bit generous there, but you're certainly correct. It's got an investigative element to it, and so the point is that it will lead to the murderer being uncovered. What's the actual role of the cow, so far as Maimonides understands it?
Shall I?
Please.
I was just thinking there seems to be, Maimonides seems to look at it as if there is a time lapse, that there is some time before the neck will be broken and this time will be usefully used. I didn't hear that in the earlier passage, in the actual Talmud passage.
So you're absolutely right. He seems to be suggesting that maybe the actual process wouldn't happen that frequently because something would intervene to stop it happening. Like identifying the murderer would happen and then they wouldn't need to go ahead with it. You're absolutely right. It's not mentioned in the Torah that there'd be a delay, but I suppose purely in terms of practice, like taking a cow all the way out into the countryside to this particular unplanted wadi, there's not that many of them in Israel. And so there would be kind of a delay built into it, but you're right. He's building slightly on the text. But the most fundamental thing we can take away from what Maimonides has written is that basically it's completely arbitrary. He's saying the point of taking a cow out there and breaking its neck is that people will look and think, oh, they're taking a cow out there and breaking its neck. He's not even trying really to find any particular relevance to the fact that it's a cow rather than a sheep, the fact that we're breaking its neck rather than cutting its foot off, as in, he seems to just say that a completely arbitrary, weird process that's going to make people point has a value to it, but he doesn't even try to explain how they chose this particular weird process that would make people point. Are we convinced or not? Alison's looking deeply skeptical, which is a very legitimate reaction to it as well. Let's see what some of the other explanations for it are. At the bottom of the page, we have Ibn Ezra, who was a Spanish commentator from the 17th, 16th century, I think, actually, who did in fact visit York during his lifetimes. We know that, so he has a certain relevance going on there. Who would like to read some Ibn Ezra for us? Alison, please.
It is possible that God arranged for the murder to be committed near to this town because those who live there have probably been committing similar acts to this one. If not, a murder would not have been committed in their vicinity. The schemes of God are far beyond us.
Thank you. So that's a slightly odd approach to it, but it also has a certain logic. This is not so much him trying to explain, again, like Maimonides, he's kind of skipping over what's the purpose of there being a cow, what's the purpose of breaking its neck and so on, to what's the overall function of the procedure in society, what's the social function of the procedure. And he is saying that it is about teaching a lesson to the people from the town involved, that there must be some sort of immorality going on there, because otherwise God would not have inflicted this collective punishment on them of having to take one of their cows and sacrifice it when they'd rather have kept it for themselves and eaten it. Fair enough. And we are going to come back to this idea of whether or not the town has a collective responsibility for an unsolved murder that happens in its vicinity. But again, we don't really have any approach to why is there a cow? Why are we breaking its neck? What's the significance of it being an out-of-way bit of land? Let's go on and see what we've got. Now we've got another Torah commentary from a similar period, the Mishnehkesev, and he's being a little bit more honest in his approach to that one. Adrian, are you able to read this, or is your locale not suited to it? You don't have to if you.
Hello.
Hello.
This is from the Mishnehkesev to Deuteronomy 21, verse 1, there is no need for a ritual to have a specific necessary basis, all the more so in matters designed to influence the many. It is reason enough for this ritual to stir up everyone's hearts of those who live nearby, and this action will make them gather, put their heads together, remember what happened, and guard their roads.
Thank you. So he's taking a very different approach. First of all, he's being a little bit honest about the fact that we don't have a blooming clue. And he is holding up his hands to that and saying there's no need for it to have a specific basis. So unlike Maimonides, who he just glossed over the question, the Mishnehkesev is saying, like Maimonides, the main point is that it's theatrical. It's a bit of theatre that's supposed to get attention. It's supposed to stir up people's hearts. And he's saying, that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with ritual being intrinsically meaningless. And that's a really interesting message for Jewish ritual generally. And we can be thinking about that when it comes to all sorts of things, from circumcision to standing and sitting. Maybe a lot of these things is actually about the theatre rather than about something intrinsic in what's being done. But he's also done something else. He's added in another function. Does anyone notice what it is?
He's made the tacit assumption that someone knows who did the murder.
He's done
is
that,
like-
although maybe Maimonides did that as well, because he was suggesting that it would cause general public comment and cause the murderer being found. But you're right, he's very clearly accepting that someone will know what's going on.
Yeah, and he thinks that this will motivate them to stop concealing it.
Absolutely. And there's one more thing he wants to motivate them to do. There's one more incentive he's attached.
Improve security.
Improve security, or at least safety. He wants them to guard their roads. And so this is where we're beginning to have this idea that there is in fact some communal responsibility for any murder, even if they didn't literally wield the knife. The local town have some responsibility to make sure that the dark alleyways are properly lit and that there aren't people walking around, committing crimes and highwaymen and that sort of thing, untested and untracked. And actually, there's maybe a little hint here that it's not an unsolved murder because the community is partly culpable. The community is the murderer to some extent because they didn't take certain steps to intervene. That point is going to be made a lot more forcefully in some of the subsequent sources, but let's keep it in mind for the moment because we're getting a little taste of it there. Lastly, on this page, we have the Ramban, as opposed to the Rambam, which is another name for Maimonides when he's got an M at the end. The Ramban, who decided to have a misleading name, has written his own commentary on it. Babette, would you be able to read this one for us?
Yes. If Maimonides is correct, there is a positive reason for carrying out the whole shebang, but the act itself is irrelevant. And it would make more sense to do it in a more fertile field, so that more people would be aware of it. In my opinion, the reason for this ritual is the same as for the Yom Kippur scapegoat and the red heifer, and therefore our sages count this among the chukim.
Thank you.
What's the
So,
chukim exactly?
the chukim, basically in the Torah, we have two different words for commandment that basically appears: mishpatim and chukim. And they're used relatively interchangeably in the Torah and in some other bits of literature as well. So like in Ahavat Olam on a Friday night, we sing mishpatim uchim. No, it's the other way around. Chukim mishpatim otanul. That one. And the rabbis are never keen on there being two interchangeable words for things because they say they must mean different things. And so they invented two different meanings for them. And it's a useful distinction they invented, even though it's not really a real one. They said mishpatim are the laws which we understand the explanation for and which we would have to create for ourselves if they weren't handed down at Sinai. And the chukim is the other stuff that we can never possibly understand because it makes no sense. So laws against murder and theft and lying in court and all that sort of thing are mishpatim because they have an important social function. And if God hadn't told us murder was wrong, we would need to introduce our own rules against murder, as every single country in the world has done, because you can't have a society otherwise. Whereas you also have some chukim, which are the sacrificial laws And in this case, we've got the red heifer, which is when if you've touched a dead body, you are considered to be impure until you've been smeared with water that's been had the ashes of a particular type of cow boiled in it. Like, it makes no sense. It's all this sort of performative ritual material. And so Ramban is putting this very squarely into the category of performative ritual that has no intrinsic meaning. And he seems much more comfortable than any of the others to admit that. And he's using the rabbi's technique for admitting they don't know the answer to something without having to admit they don't know the answer to something, which is to label it a hook, to say it's something we're not supposed to understand. We just do it. And yeah, the others have tried to come up with explanations for it. And certainly the Ramban is unconvinced by Maimonides' explanation, because he says, if it was about publicity, you'd want to do it in a place where more people were going to see it rather than going to an out-of-town location, which is also a very fair point, actually. We've got a couple more possible explanations from slightly more recent sources now. The Bechor Shor, who is a 17th century commentator. Sam, are you in a position to read this one? Oh, you've unmasked as well. How about that? Hello, Miriam. Hello, Ruth.
So yeah, I can read this. All this God did to give a voice to the victim, and one who had travelled from their home and not returned, and nobody knew what had become of them. Members of his household and his family will travel to the place where they saw these events taking place, and perhaps they will identify the corpse. Incidentally, when did you plan the subject for this session?
Some months ago. It's ended up being slightly unfortunately redolent, yes. But this is a really interesting phrase he uses, kol lenirtzach, to give a voice to the deceased, like to the corpse. A nirtzach is a corpse. What does that mean? Like, obviously, we're not giving a voice to the corpse. What did he understand himself as writing?
You could maybe broaden the meaning of voice a little bit. That obviously the corpse isn't literally speaking, and there's no real informational content to this ritual, but it will have an impact on people, as mentioned in the previous interpretations. So he's saying that the important thing is the impact that it has on people, so that this dead person, this murdered person, is able to have an impact on people even after their death, when presumably in their last moments they were unable to make any serious impact on people.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it. And I think to some extent, this is the function of an inquest these days, where the family of the deceased are represented and have a function, and they're normally not really representing themselves per se, but they're acting on behalf of their lost one, and they will be trying to get justice for them. And if they were allowed to die because the company who manufactured the scaffolding didn't fit it properly, then that will be a point that's made and rectified. And so there's an idea about almost preventing future deaths, but also about providing a level of catharsis for the family as well. So we're talking about here a family who might not know what's become of their loved one, because at the time when there was no news media, you wouldn't immediately be able to work that out. And so actually them being able to identify that there is a body in this particular place and then come and identify the body would be really, really important for them, both for emotional catharsis and also practically, because if it hadn't been confirmed that their relative had died, if they'd just gone missing, that can cause all sorts of problems under the halakha for inheritance and the widow and all sorts of bits and bobs like that. What do we think of this as an idea, as a value in general? Never mind what the calf's got to do with it. We are going to come back to that. But this idea of giving a voice to the victim of crime and to their families, does that seem like a value that it's good is being brought out of this slightly strange ritual? Or does it feel like it's shoehorned in a little bit? What do we think?
I mean, it's not a completely unnatural fit, but it does seem a little bit artificial.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's also important to think, though, about what would be happening when we had an identified murderer rather than an unidentified murderer. Does anyone know what would be happening?
Well, a trial, presumably.
There'd be certainly a trial of some sort, or like under slightly later law, there'd definitely be a trial. Under earlier law, we're not entirely clear whether or not there would be. But what would then happen? What would the role of the victim's family be in this?
Well, that they could demand the death of the murderer.
not only could they demand the death of the murderer, they would not have a choice but to demand the death of the murderer. There'd be blood guilt. They wouldn't necessarily enforce the death of the murderer themselves, but under the halakha, there would be a blood guilt, which would mean that the murderer would receive the death penalty unless in certain circumstances they fled to what were called the cities of refuge, which is if it was a slightly accidental killing, they could be saved from that. But they would in all circumstances have to pay what was called a kofer, a ransom, which is not really a ransom in like the kidnap sense that we understand it today, but they'd have to pay a payout, like I guess the equivalent of life insurance almost to the family of the person whose life they took. And so actually, although what the Bechor Shor is saying seems a little bit out from the text, if we think about the context when the family would have had that role in receiving compensation and being able to articulate themselves when we knew who the murderer was, he's suggesting there must be a way to find a role for the family in situations where we don't know who the murderer was. And that seems a perfectly fair inference, even if it's not necessarily one that's obvious from the text. There's one more explanation from the olden days before we look at something from Catholic Bible Quarterly, which is slightly more recently. This is the Shadal, who is an Italian commentator in the 18th century, who in many ways had quite a slightly modern commentary on the Torah and was beginning to look much more at the way modern ideas might fit into these things. And he suggests, actually, who wants to read the Shadal? You can do it in an Italian accent if it's more fun. Go on, Chris, I think we might be back to you. I won't ask Ruth because she's dandling.
I can't really do an Italian accent.
You can do it in your regular accent.
I could do it in a Yorkshire accent, see if that cuts it. But just that point you made about the compensation.
Yes.
That I'm pretty sure that occurred in Icelandic law under the Norse, which would have been sort of 9th, 10th century, this side. So it spreads far and wide.
I'm sure it does. And like, it makes a certain amount of sense, really. Like before you've got police and before you've got public prosecutions, that's, you know, I can't think of many better ways to enforce things to a certain extent.
Right, yeah. Right, are we in Shadal?
We are in Shadal.
Right. Because of their belief that retribution would come to land on which blood was shed, steps had to be taken to ensure that they did not rush to execute an innocent person on whom suspicion had fallen without compelling testimony and clear evidence.
Ooh, thank you. So the Shadal is telling us two things here. First of all, he's telling us that there was a genuine belief that the land on which a murder happened would be in some way cursed or contaminated until the murder was dealt with. But he's giving us a very different idea of what this ritual was about. So we had some of the earlier sources like Maimonides and the Mishnehkesev saying that it was about identifying the murderer and finding them. And as Babette said, sometimes doing that in a hurry to do it before we have actually gone ahead and killed the cow. What's the Shadal saying it's about? He's saying quite the opposite. Go on, Sam.
This is actually
time.
Or similar beliefs are actually quite common in ancient societies. So in a wide range of ancient societies, there was a belief that serious crimes, particularly murder, sort of polluted society, or in this case, the land. The attachment to land is, I think, a particularly Israelite Jewish one. But for example, in ancient Greek society, they believed that murder created a sort of pollution in society, and that the normal way to get rid of that was by trying and convicting and then executing the murderer. So that trials didn't just form a sort of, I mean, yes, it was to prevent further murders, but nowadays we would understand that, you know, a system of justice provides some sort of deterrent, whereas back then they thought of it more like a disease, that a murder would organically lead to more murders, and that the treatment for this was justice. And then in cases where there was no murder or the murderer was unknown, they would have various procedures for trying something, sometimes an animal or even an object. There are lots of cases of animals being put on trial, even a few of, you know, things like roof tiles being put on trial when they'd fallen on people, killed them. And this is, I think, an explicit mention of this kind of belief.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the Shadal's concern is clearly not so much about finding the actual, I mean, not at all about finding the actual murderer, but rather not hurrying to execute anyone in order to save the land from its contamination. And so actually he is suggesting that this was almost God's sop to a slightly superstitious people who might have rushed to do something completely up the wrong street because they wanted to save their land from becoming uninhabitable and becoming unusable. And they would have rushed to a lynching type situation. And he would much prefer that they channeled it into killing a calf than into killing a human being. Like that, I'm glad the Shadal gets a thumbs up there. He deserves it. Now, this is a slightly different, it's a slightly different approach. Hello. It's a slightly different approach to ritual in general. He seems to be agreeing that it's kind of arbitrary somewhat, but not as much as the others. Because what in Shadal's words would we, not in his words, he doesn't say it in his words, what do we think consistently with his view he would say the role of the calf is in these circumstances? Go on, Babette. You'll need to unmute, I'm afraid. I'm inviting you to unmute. I'm not sure if it will.
Oh,
there we go. There we go.
Thank you. Sorry.
No.
That was a bit silly. No, what was it? No, well, I mean, this lynching idea, I think, is terribly is universal and also goes through time, isn't it? To calm people and not have rash behavior. It's a good idea to have some kind of sacrificial act that would make calm people down and have the feeling that they've done something.
Absolutely, but I'm really glad you used the word sacrificial. Is this a sacrifice?
It made me think of it when the whole thing with the broken neck and the cow. It very much made me think of it. I mean, it's a horrible word, but people use it in terrible circumstances where they shouldn't. People do, isn't it? That's what they feel they ought to do, a sacrifice.
I mean, technically, it's not a sacrifice, but you can certainly see parallels between it and sacrifices.
Well, I psychologically, I see it as people get very afraid when a murder is committed and they want to soothe God. I mean, maybe not consciously exactly like that, but they want to calm their fear. And they feel if they sacrifice to God, then God will stop being angry and no more horrible things will happen. That's psychologically so, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. Interestingly, though, there's something slightly unusual about the way that we're doing this. And I'm going to take us back to the biblical text here. Where is the word? They shall break the heifer's neck. Here we go. That didn't go. This word here. Va'arfu sham et ha'egla, and they shall araf the egla, which is the calf. This word araf, it's a very, very unusual word in the biblical text. And the only other place we have it used in relation to an animal is if you mess up the sacrifice of a bird, so you accidentally render the bird impure or something like that during the process so that you can't go through with the sacrifice, then we also have this word. That's what you have to do to the bird who you've slightly soiled or made unfit for it. And it seems to be about snapping the neck. We're not entirely clear that's what it means because the problem with biblical Hebrew is no one's got a clue what any of it means really, but it seems to be about snapping a neck. Now that first of all tells us something about whether or not it's a sacrifice. And that certainly suggests that technically speaking is very much not a sacrifice because this is something we do when a sacrifice has gone wrong. It's a completely separate and unusual thing you do to an animal. Obviously, as Babette says, it's psychologically maybe very much fulfilling the role of one, but in terms of like its categorization, that would suggest it's not. But also, what happens when you kill by breaking the neck? And of course, none of us actually have the experience of doing this directly. Picture the scene literally. Oh, hello, Dolly. Picture the scene. What are you seeing? They've got this cow, they've broken its neck. What is there at the scene? What isn't there at the scene?
Is there no blood?
There's no blood. What's the significance of there being no blood? So, go on, Babette.
Well, first of all, you can't eat the animal. It's not kosherly slaughtered.
Definitely.
And it's no murder. I mean,
It's no murder. Well, we say it's no murder. Obviously, wringing someone's neck without blood is still murder. But you're right. It's being differentiated very much so. And so Adrian, is that you putting a hand up? I can't. No. And so the likelihood is, if we come back to what the Shadal is suggesting, this is almost a reenactment, but a reenactment with a few key differences. Now, we don't know what we're reenacting. We might be reenacting the murder, in which case the calf is the victim. But more likely, given the fact that we're doing it in a bloodless way, we are not reenacting, but enacting the execution of the murderer. And we're doing this in a bloodless way because we want to save this patch of land from having the blood guilt on it of an unsolved murder. And so in this case, we'd say that the calf is being used not as a sacrifice per se, but as almost a stand-in or as an actor. And so we've got this excellent modern scholarly explanation from it from David P. Wright, who is a professor somewhere in the United States, who says the reason for the requirement of performing the rite in an uncultivated place is this. The murder was committed in an area of human concern, perhaps even in pardon the noises that my laptop makes, perhaps even in an uncultivated field. Sorry, perhaps even in a cultivated field. The resulting blood guilt threatened the productivity of this area. Hence, a rite which reenacts the murder is performed in an uncultivated place in order to relocate the pollution there. In this case, the pollution no longer threatens the area of human concern. So his suggestion is that we're specifically trying to move the land that's going to be forever contaminated by an unsolved murder. We don't want it to be on our nice farm where we get lots of our leeks and potatoes from. We're going to move it to this unnecessary patch of land out of town that we don't need and don't really care about if it becomes contaminated. Now, in a lot of ways, that explanation is less fun because it's a modern scholarly explanation which probably explains why this nasty cult-like ritual happened in real life, rather than the slightly nicer rabbinic explanations looking for a meaning within it or maybe failing to find a meaning within it. But it's really interestingly compelling, the idea that actually this is about freeing society of the effects of the murder or the after effects of the murder. And that's the theme that we're going to come on to here. Because the rabbis were troubled by the fact that the elders of this town had any particular role in it. And we're going to see why they were troubled by it. Alison, are you able to read this little passage, which is from about the 2nd century or so? It's from a book called Sifrei, which is a commentary on Deuteronomy.
The elders of that town say, our hands did not spill this blood, Deuteronomy 21:7. But would we even have thought that the elders were spillers of blood? Rather, they are saying, he did not come into our hands and we let him go. We did not see him and send him off. We are not guilty.
They're saying we are not guilty. But what are they not guilty of? So the trouble, the concern that the rabbis had was, of course, no one suspects the elders of actually being the murderers, in the sense that no one suspects the elders crept out of town at dead of night, pounced on this traveler, killed him, and crept back into town. And so in this case, why are they being asked to say our hands did not spill this blood? And so clearly the rabbis are interpreting spilling of blood to be very figurative there. We did not have him in our hands and we let him go. And so the idea that you can spill blood through abdication of communal responsibility is a really, really important one and a really, really powerful one. And this is saying that it's not just enough not to be the actual murderer, but you have a responsibility to prevent these sorts of violent crimes from happening within your area. And if you fail in that responsibility, you do have blood on your hands and you do have part of the blood guilt. Now, he did not come into our hands and we let him go. We did not see him and send him off. Who is him?
The victim.
Okay, talk us through the victim if we're going to read this as being the victim, Sam.
So this is a world in which people travel about, but as we've established from this story, large parts of the countryside are dangerous, either through natural dangers, you get lost, starve, die of thirst, wild beasts, and bandits. Towns, by contrast, relatively safe. Lots of people around, unlikely to die of thirst or hunger in a town, less banditry, still could get murdered in a town, but there won't just be highwaymen wandering about. So this is the nearest town to the murder. So it's a good bet that the victim had been there. So this is not, he was in our town and we sent him off into the wilderness unprotected. We didn't do that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Chris, you have a hand up.
That's part of the plot of American Werewolf in London. When the guy misses the dartboard and the guys get sent off. The guys say, as in the last words there, so the two American boys get sent off into the wilderness to be eaten by a werewolf.
Thank you. So Sam says that him is the victim, and very correctly it suggests this by saying that we didn't just let the victim go off into the wilderness without support and protection. How else might we read this? Who else could him be? Go on, Beba, or pitching mother against son. I like it.
As a comment scene. Well, it could be the murderer they're talking about, isn't it? It could be.
It could. So how would that work if it's the murderer? What's the meaning of what they're saying?
The murderer did not come into our hands and we let him go. This absolutely did not happen, they're saying. It's nothing to do with us. And, we did not see the murderer and send him off. So, I mean, it's equally possible that that's what they mean.
Absolutely. And so we've got two possible readings here. They both seem pretty plausible. One of them is saying that it is a spilling of blood if you have communal responsibility and you fail to exercise it in a way that can lead to someone dying if you fail to exercise it in terms of protecting the person or providing the person with the level of support that they need, the victim. And one reading is saying that you bear responsibility if you have the aggressor in custody or the ability to bring them into custody and you fail to do that. And so you allow someone dangerous back onto the streets or out onto the streets. They're both really powerful messages and they're both really important about responsibility. Which one do we think they mean? Hands up if you think we're talking about the victim with him here. We didn't let the victim go out without protection. All right, we've got two. Hands up if you think they mean the murderer. We didn't have the murderer and let him slip through our fingers. Got four with Babette being on both sides in a very appropriately balanced way. You're coming. Okay. So hands up if you think I'm actually going to give you an answer to this question. Alison, you're so optimistic. I'm not. But
what about hands up if you're going to give us two answers?
I am going to give you two answers, or to be slightly more precise, the Talmud is going to give you two answers. So
I got confused. I didn't mean to hold my hand up.
So the Talmud came along about 300 years after this was written and asked and had exactly the same discussion that we've just had. And let us read what they had to say. So from the top of the page, this is the Jerusalem Talmud. Elizabeth, could I ask you to do this bit?
The rabbis here in Israel understand this to be referring to the murderer, but the rabbis there in Babylon understand it to be referring to the victim. The rabbis here take it to mean the murderer did not come into our hands and we let him go rather than executing him. We did not see him and sent him off having cocked up his trial. But the rabbis there take it to mean the victim did not come into our hands and we let him go without any traveling companion. We did not see him and sent him off with no food to sustain him.
Thank you. So the Talmud has beautifully illustrated both of the possible interpretations and has specifically worked out what the form of words could mean for each of them. Just instantly, cocked up his trial is my translation, but it really is literally what that excellent Hebrew word im means. Whenever you have that sort of doubling of letters, it's always slightly onomatopoeic, and it's like, oh, you made a right imam of that sort of meaning that we've got there. It really is about sort of messing up procedurally.
Something else interesting about this that I notice it's in a section of the Jerusalem Talmud regarding the ritual of the sota water. which is another sort of rather arbitrary theatrical ritual.
Absolutely, and that's the context in which it appears. It's in the final chapter of Sota. They're talking about other arbitrary rituals that have kind of dropped into disuse, not misuse. And that's exactly where it comes up. You're right to spot that. And then we have a commentary, which is a commentary on this passage, and it's telling us something even more about what these sub-phrases could mean, what it is to let him go, to send him off. This is a commentary from Rabbi Israel Lipschitz, who wrote a commentary called Tiferet Yisrael. Very, very good modern commentary. I say modern, like sort of 19th century, but it's beginning to really get some proper modern ideas in there. Elsewhere in his commentary, it includes the word orangutan. Like finding the word orangutan in a Hebrew source is one of the highlights of my day. This is not about the orangutan, however. This is about highwaymen. Christopher, could I ask you to read this bit?
Certainly, thank you. But we let him go without food, so that he was forced to become a highwayman, and on account of this, he was killed. Or, it seems to me, if they had fed him properly, he would have had the strength to resist the murderer, and he would have been saved. And we sent him off without any traveling companion, so he traveled alone and was thus killed by highwaymen, who assumed that he had no loved ones to miss him or ask after him.
Thank you. Now, the bit that's interesting here is that very first bit, the suggestion that maybe the significance to letting him go without food meant not that he was just going to be vulnerable and on his own and a bit too weak to resist, but he was the murderer. That's how he became the murderer, was being let go without food. He was forced to become a highwayman, and on this account, he was killed. What are the implications of that? Let's just give ourselves a second to think about what that means.
That rather undermines the narrative that this guy has been murdered. Because I would suggest, and I'm not sure how halakha bears this out, but I think it might agree with me, that if you're a highwayman and you go and attack someone and they kill you, you've not been murdered.
So you're absolutely right. And this is first of all raising the slightly complex issue of if you find a corpse, you don't actually know whether or not there's been a murder, because there could have been a completely justifiable reason for the killing. And so Sam's right that this potentially undermines the whole basis of the narrative. And of course, although no one seems to have recorded that point until this 19th century commentary, it was there the whole time. Like we knew when we first read it at the back of our minds that not every corpse becomes a corpse as the result of a murder. But there's something slightly more here. We let him go without food, so he was forced to become a highwayman. This is about crime prevention. Go on, Babette.
That's what I was thinking. Crime prevention, also a whole social contract, isn't it? Preventing crime right from the beginning, you know, feed people and make sure they're okay right from the start, so that crime doesn't develop.
Absolutely. Is anyone going to mention Tony Blair, or do I have to do it myself? Because this is tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime.
Please don't mention Tony Blair. It's got a strongly Scandinavian element to it as well, though, hasn't it? Or Scandinavia has a strongly this to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Might one reading be something to do with the importance of hospitality as a way of crime prevention? And if he'd had food beforehand, he might not have become a highwayman.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not just that food can prevent you becoming a highwayman in the sense that you're not in need, but also the sort of the companionship and the sort of socialization that you get from being treated like a person and being given that level of dignity can make you feel like you're not on the margins of society and you don't need to spend your life hanging out in the wilderness pouncing on people. Absolutely. And this is a real message to all of those projects that are about using social programs to do crime prevention. This is the people who organize activities in inner city areas. This is the anti-knife crime programs that are not just about throwing people in prison and stop and search, but about trying to create sort of social structures so that people don't feel they have to carry knives, don't feel they have to go into a gang in order to find self-worth. This is a really early interpretation that's giving us a really quite progressive understanding of the community's responsibility. And again, if we think back to the context 2 texts ago of where this is coming from, the elders are the people who have blood on their hands if they fail to do this. And what have they failed to do in this case? They have failed to prevent someone else from turning into a criminal, and they thereby get blood on their hands. So this is a really extensive notion of what responsibility is, and that you're responsible not just for your own actions and inactions, but for even quite remote consequences of your own actions and inactions. And it's about looking at the fact that every death, particularly unexplained deaths, come at the end of a long chain of events, and you can always go one level back in the chain and find another cause for it. So the proximal cause of this death might be the person was pounced on by highwaymen and refused to hand over their wallet. But before that, we're then beginning to ask, why was the highwayman there? Why was the person there? And before that, we're going to begin to ask, what happened when these people were last in a civilized area? Who did care for them? Who didn't care for them? And each step, we're looking back and finding more and more causes. And in one sense, it might look like we're actually going to these extremes to forgive and to excuse criminals. But I think it's more than that. This is about the primacy of saving life and about all the different ways through which life can be saved. The very first reference to saving life we had was in the commentary of the Mishnehkesev, which said that it was about guarding their roads. And of course, guarding their roads is way down the line compared to this stuff. If the only thing that's keeping someone safe from a highwayman is the fact that there's a policeman standing on the corner, or if we're looking at it in the very sad context we're currently in, if the only people that's keeping women safe in bars is the fact that there's an undercover police officer who's been funded to stand in there, we're missing huge parts of the picture here. And that's not the most effective way of dealing with it. And it's certainly not the only way of dealing with it. This is about the importance of going to the root cause in order to prevent crimes from happening and in order to undermining the need and the push factors that cause anyone to commit crimes. And so this is a really interesting criminological text that we've got going on here. We have a little bit more over the page. Over here, we have a commentary of the Melbourne, who is another 19th century commentator. Sam, if you're there, could I get you to do this one?
Yeah, okay. The elders say, we did not cause this murder through failing to provide the murderer with food, on account of which they were forced to kill someone to extort bread to satiate their hunger, nor did we fail to provide an escort to the victim so that he would not travel alone in a dangerous place. It's a bit reminiscent of that. There was that guy who got murdered when he was mugged for a cheeseburger, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it's absolutely that sort of scenario. And the Melbourne is, of course, very comfortably, without acknowledging it, sitting on the fence between exactly whether that him that we were discussing is the victim or the murderer, and he's going for both without telling us that he's going for both, and that's great because it probably is both, really. But specifically, again, this phrase, they were forced to kill someone to extort bread. Mukhrach laharog. It's a really unusual use of that idea of being forced to kill someone, because when we talk about being forced to kill someone normally, what sort of context might we be referring to?
Well,
there are definitely such contexts. Sorry, go on, Sam.
You can't do even to save your own life, isn't it? You know, if you've got a gun to your head and you're told to murder someone,
so
you have to let yourself be killed rather than...
That's slightly complicated. So the Talmud does say that if you have what's called a rotseach, if someone is pursuing you to, not a rotseach, a rodef, if someone is pursuing you to kill them, you are able to kill them. And you're right, Sam, that if they've got the gun to your head, you can't. And so something clearly changes, and it's not entirely clear why it's okay to do it during the pursuit, but not after they catch you. But we'll save that discussion for a general point. So there's certainly circumstances in self-defense when you're forced to kill someone. When else might we be forced to kill someone? We can think outside a Jewish context. We can think in a modern context as well. So particularly forms of self-defense that might happen in abusive relationships is one of the most common areas we talk about it. There was recently, and I'm going to completely forget her name now, the lady, Sally Chapman, someone was released from prison having killed her husband after 20 years of abusive marriage because she just felt completely impelled, completely forced into it. That's the kind of context when we're referring to being forced to kill someone normally, and also maybe like, you know, the sort of extreme suicide bomber about to detonate their vest situation as well. This is a really unusual use of the idea of being forced to kill someone, though. What do we think of this being used here? Are you forced to kill someone if they've got food and you're hungry? Probably not. And there's probably at least some alternatives. Right, there might not be, but there's probably are at least some, and certainly even if in the moment there's no alternative, there might be longer term alternatives for this person. So what do we mean by this term mukhrach, forced? We must mean something slightly different to being forced to kill someone who's about to detonate a suicide bomb or something like that. And I think it must mean forced, like by social pressures or by the social context, or who is impelled, which is one of those words that you very rarely get. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that much sometimes, but who is impelled into doing this. And it's recognizing that people act per force and that not necessarily every criminal is guilty in and of themselves, or is morally guilty, or has had the greatest amount of free will or choice in what they're doing and what they're not doing. But immediately, and to avoid the offensive sort of victim blaming that we might otherwise be having, the Malbim goes on to say, and it's also about providing an escort to the victim, and it's also about ensuring that there's a context that keeps people safe from being attacked, even if these attacks might be impelled. And so we have this idea about preventing the criminal from having to do their crime, but we're also recognizing that sometimes there are people who just commit crimes for the hell of it. And so classic tragic murders like the one we've seen this week, no one's suggesting there was any element of self-defense. No one's suggesting there was any element of defense at all. Like, this was clearly someone who just decided to commit a murder because they decided to commit a murder. And in this context, the focus flips to the victim. And so the Malbim is really cleverly using both of those possible interpretations to cover all the possible bases, really. But in all those possible bases, the responsibility ultimately lies with the elders of the city, with the people who have the duty to maintain a safe place where people aren't being pushed into crime and people aren't being victimized by crime. Our last reading comes from Barbanel, who is a Spanish commentator from the 16th century or so. Who would like to read this one? It's the last one, so someone can have a celebration. Go on, Christopher, how about you?
My pleasure, thank you. This is me trying to read that thing. It says you're invited to unmute. I'm not trying to scare you or anything. The elders' wrong was that they did not persuade the people to act uprightly, keeping to the ways of the Torah, that there should be no spilling of blood amongst them. Also, the elders failed in that they did not identify the murderer. If there was a strict and exacting justice in the town, as is appropriate, the hand of the murderer would not have been strong enough to go through with the killing a human being on the borders of the town, because their heart would have been too afraid of the town's justice system, for its judges would chase after him and overtake them and trample on the land of their life.
Thank you. So, again, Abarbanel is doing this very clever rabbinic thing where he's combining different ideas in the same sentence, and we wouldn't necessarily notice it if we weren't looking closely. So we have the elders failed in that they did not identify the murderer. If there was strict and exacting justice in the town as is appropriate, the hand of the murderer would not have been strong enough to go through with killing. So we've actually immediately got a sort of time lapse going on in the way he's describing this. They failed to identify the murderer after the death, because you can't identify a murderer before a death. But also, if they'd had a decent justice system in the first place, no one would have dared do a murder. There wouldn't have been the opportunity, not just there wouldn't have been the opportunity, but specifically no one would have dared. It just wouldn't dawn on anyone's mind to commit a murder like this. And so this is again about the social responsibility for creating a safe place, and a place where murderers or would-be murderers know that they're not going to get away with it. And this is again an idea that we see sadly too often in the modern world. Only yesterday, the Centre for Women's Justice published a report about how they're suggesting that rape has been effectively decriminalized in the UK because the threshold for prosecuting it and the barriers to people reporting it have been heightened so much that it becomes completely impractical, and that's why conviction rates have plummeted. And that's again the sort of environment that Abarbanel is talking about here, where people don't feel afeared of being prosecuted and being convicted, and so the deterrent effect isn't there. But this final phrase, trample on the land of their life, it's an extraordinary phrase. I've not been able to find it anywhere else in rabbinic literature. What do we think might be going on there?
Is it a sort of euphemism?
It's probably a sort of euphemism in some sense, but I mean, it can't be literal because their life isn't a land. But where else have we had land in this conversation?
Well, there's land that was supposedly polluted by the murder, and there's land that is being deliberately polluted by the ritual with the cow, possibly instead of the land that would have been polluted otherwise.
Absolutely. And I think Abarbanel is using the idea of land figuratively, and he's moving beyond this ritual, which he doesn't really address in this passage. He's not really interested in the calf at all. He's interested in the idea of the social responsibility. And he's suggesting that actually the most important land is like the land in our minds almost. And so the elders of the town need to be having a land in their minds that they're dreaming of and that they're trying to create that is going to be safe and just, and where people don't feel impelled to commit crimes, and where people don't feel brave enough to commit crimes, and where people feel safe from crimes. They need to have that land in their mind and then be enacting it. The victim needs to have a land in their mind where they're going to be safe and where they feel comfortable walking down the street without having to clutch their door keys ready to get into their front door the moment that they're safe to. The murderer has this imaginary land in their mind where they just know that they can't commit crimes, and there's no need for them to commit crimes, but also no opportunity for them to commit crimes, no motive for them to commit crimes. And they know that if they do commit crimes, they would be punished. And actually the land that's being contaminated, Abarbanel is maybe suggesting, is not the physical land, because obviously that's not a thing. We all know that. The land that's being contaminated is this idealized land that should be living in everyone's mind, and that in fact isn't always there. And so for me, this is an absolutely fascinating text, even though the text itself is weird. The text itself is weird, and then you look in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly and you find the explanation for it that's in a historical context. That's fine. But far more interesting is the way that it's been treated, and the way that the rabbis reacted to this ritual that they didn't really understand, and these words that they didn't really connect together with it, and the way that they turned it into an astonishing model of social responsibility and about dreaming of the land that you want to inhabit and finding a way to enact it, and placing everything at the responsibility of our leaders, because if they're not responsible, what's the point of them? This is an amazing exercise in rabbinic creativity, and it's a hugely powerful example of effective, compassionate criminology, effectively. And I do just want to go back to that phrase, which I think is hugely important at the moment, particularly. I'm now obviously not going to find it. There we go. Sheyaha kol lenitzach, there should be a voice for the victim. This is victim-centered ideology in a way that's not vengeful. This is putting the victim first, not in the sense of trying to recover compensation or to kill the murderer or to do spilling of more blood in their memory. It's a blood-free ritual that's designed actually to put the victim front and foremost. And I think in many ways, this is the equivalent of the hashtag Sarah Everard and of the placards that are remembering her and of the vigils. This is about ensuring that a death that's been completely tragic isn't allowed to just slip by meaninglessly, but is a moment for communal reflection and contemplation, and that people are forced to actually stop and think about what's happened and what's gone wrong and how to avoid it being happening that way again in future. And so I hope you've all had the opportunity to consider some interesting things, and that maybe if not going away and breaking a calf's neck, you are nonetheless going to be able to reflect on the social context in which lots of these things happen. And thank you all so much for joining.